starting a new project for a friend of mine, a couple friends of mine, and their wedding coming up pretty soon. Basically wanted to make a sign with their name on it and the wedding date so they could hang up wherever they wanted. Starting with a 1/4 inch thick sheet of red oak plywood, and then I'm going to end up making a frame going around the sides of it with either walnut or mahogany. Not quite sure which one yet. I'll decide that in a little bit. First thing I had to do starting out, I'm a little late in the process. I didn't think to videotape this until after I started. First thing, in order to wood burn the name on here, I had to figure out what kind of fonts I wanted for their name. Had to print it out pretty big, so I got a couple sheets of paper here. It's actually cardstock, and I'll explain why in just a second. Printed it out. When I printed it out, I flipped it horizontally so that way it's kind of like a mirror image. And then I got some trace paper and kind of fastened it around the sides of the paper so that way I could trace it. Just trace it with any old lead pencil. I just use a mechanical pencil. It actually works out pretty well. Traced it out, then I had to flip that sheet of trace paper over onto the piece of wood, and this is pretty much the process I use for wood burning all the time. Flip that piece of trace paper over onto the wood, so now it's reading left to right, and then I have to tape that down, secure that down pretty well, and then I'll just use maybe like a socket or a nut driver or something to rub the trace paper on, so that way the lead from the pencil transfers onto the wood. Then from there I'll go ahead and outline, which I've already done with the wood burner, and then I'm going to go ahead and start shading in. So I'll keep you guys updated on the process. Here we go. This wood burning is a really long process, so I sped up these videos quite a bit. If you notice, there's some pausing that I take, and there's a little steel wire brush up at the top of the screen. Basically, as I would go and do the wood burning, there would be a lot of gunk buildup on the end of the iron. So I had to go brush that off real quick so that way I could get a nice clean burn consistently. If I just left it on there, the burn would get lighter and lighter and lighter, so I had to keep it consistent, keep it the same temperature and the same, I guess, contact point from the iron to the wood. I know there's probably a much faster way of doing this. If I had a, let's say a CNC machine or a laser engraver or something like that, it would make the process a lot faster, and depending on, how many more of these I do, I may end up biting the bullet and getting one of those, even though they're so expensive. But yeah, if anybody has any tips or tricks on how to make this process go a little bit faster, I would definitely love to hear them, because when I do this kind of detailed work, it takes quite a long time. Now, here I am measuring the outer part of the board, the width and the height, so that way I can get a really good measurement on the frame that's going to go around it. I decided to use African mahogany because that's the board that I had enough of. Didn't quite have enough walnut, even though I would have liked to use it. For you visual learners, I am drawing a picture of the board and then the frame that's going to go around it. I've got a little trick that I use to calculate the exact length of those frame pieces on the top and bottom and the left and the right. For the router bit that I'm going to be using, it's got a 1/2 inch cutout, and I've got a 2-inch wide board. So basically what I'm going to do is, instead of using some algebra, I'm just going to add 1.5 inches on the top and 1.5 inches on the bottom right there. So technically adding 3 inches to the width of the board because there's a 1/2 inch overlay. Doing the same thing with the top and the bottom boards, just add 3 inches and we've got our distances. I'm cutting the boards down to just a little bit more than 2 inches, so that way I can send them through the planer and clean them up real nice. Right here, I noticed that the faces of those two boards, the front and the back, were a little bit rough, so I wanted to send them through the planer so that way I could clean them up and minimize a little bit of sanding later on. Now it's time to cut the miters. Wanted to double check my 45 degrees on each of those boards in the beginning just to double check that my setup was right, because even if it's off by about half a degree or so, even on both sides, it could really hinder the joint as you put it together. Now we're just checking the dry fit of these boards just to make sure I got good lengths on them, and then checking the good angles. Had to go back and cut a few, but there's a big error that I'll pull up in just a second. I wanted to fancy up the face frame just a little bit, so I tilted the table saw to about 7 degrees or so to get a little bit more detail and angles on there. The router bit I'm going to be using to cut out these slots in the frame is an 1/8 inch slot cutter, so I wanted to get a good measurement on the thickness of the middle board in there. So we're at about 0.21 inches, so not quite a quarter. I could have used a 1/4 inch slot cutter, but I wanted to ease into it and get a really tight fit. So here we are taking the first pass with the 1/8 inch slot cutter. Now that we've got a good fit, it's time to cut the rest. Here's where I goofed up. This is the first time using this jig, and right there I'm pausing because now that once I put that middle board in there, the corners don't fit into the corner pieces to be able to clamp, because I've got the joint piece in the middle. So what I'm doing now is I'm going to send them through the table saw, cut off that back part of the slot, so that way it's a little bit more like a frame to where you just set the backing piece in. So I'm just cutting those off, easing up on it, and then cutting the rest of them out. One last dry fit before the glue up. Got to apply the glue on all the sides so that way we get a nice clean joint that fits well together. Got it all clamped up. Now we got to wipe off that squeeze out with a wet rag so that way it doesn't dry and make it a little bit harder to sand. Now that we've got it all together, during this process and between those two takes, I went ahead and put the polyurethane on just because it's a long process. Didn't really need to see that. Now I'm sanding it up to 2000 grit for the final sanding, give it a nice clean polish. At this particular time, I decided to use a microfiber cloth to clean off the excess little polyurethane that got sanded off. Sometimes I use a t-shirt. Sometimes I'll just use a rag that doesn't really have any lint on it. Now what I'm doing is I'm just drawing a pencil line so I can figure out where to put these nails on the sides whenever I start to drill the holes. I know there are some brackets or some screw-on clamps that I could be using here instead of nails. I didn't have any of those, didn't want to go to the store to get them, so I just went ahead and put some nails in there. That's really the only thing that's going to be fitting inside this frame. If they want something else to that exact size, I would have to make something new. Now it's time to attach the picture frame hangers. So I'm spacing it about 3/4 of an inch from the top of the frame. Wanted to space them out at about 18 inches wide for personal reasons. Screwed in pretty nicely after I drilled a pilot hole. Here's the final product. Congratulations to the Howards. I wish nothing but the best for you guys. And a special shout out to Aaron because yes, it absolutely was a fun project. If you liked the video, please give it a thumbs up, subscribe, share, whichever, and thank you guys for watching.